Hi folks, something a little different today. I'm going to just go straight audio and give you an image that seems to work for a lot of other people, so I'll give it a shot. In this video, I will demonstrate that Jordan Peterson misinterpreted Bill C-16. I will concede that he has a very tenuous point when he criticizes the bill, but he ultimately greatly exaggerated and misrepresented the bill. I will also point out the deeply conspiratorial thinking inherent in his criticisms of the bill, as well as the way he has created a controversy around the bill to promote himself as a public intellectual and profit financially by feeding and exploiting the fear of transgender people. Peterson is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He became a YouTube star in September of 2016 after he objected to Bill C-16, a Canadian law that added gender identity and expression to a list of protected identities. Peterson claimed that the law would compel him to use people's preferred pronouns, including gender-neutral pronouns. However, the text of Bill C-16 never mentions gender-neutral pronouns. I will dive into the text of Bill C-16 and some related documents that Peterson cites in a moment, but first I want to correct the way many have chosen to criticize Peterson on this issue. A lot of his critics have accused Peterson of misgendering people or refusing to use his students' preferred pronouns. This is objectively false. He never did this and has even said he would probably use a person's pronouns if asked. I therefore wish those on the left who want to refute Peterson would stop repeating this claim. It causes his fans to tune us out, and it seems like an unnecessary misrepresentation when he has taken such an objectively incorrect stance on this bill. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's dive into the bill. I will tackle Bill C-16 first before moving on to the associated Ontario Human Rights Commission document Peterson takes issue with. So for those familiar with Peterson's stance, don't think I have overlooked it. Having read over Bill C-16 a few times, I have not found anything in it that compels people to use gender-neutral pronouns or a person's preferred pronouns. In fact, if you search the text of Bill C-16, you will not find the word pronoun at all. Not once. Interesting. But maybe I missed something. I don't have a legal degree and I'm not even Canadian, so perhaps I don't have the relevant expertise to understand it. So let's see what some Canadian legal experts have to say on the subject. In a letter to the Canadian Senate, the Canadian Bar Association weighed in on the issue. In a section titled C-16 Will Not Impede Freedom of Expression, Renee J. Basque, the president of the Canadian Bar Association, writes, quote, "Recently the debate has turned to whether the amendments will force individuals to embrace concepts, even use pronouns, which they find objectionable. This is a misunderstanding of human rights and hate crimes legislation." In the next section, titled Hate Crimes and Freedom of Expression, he goes on to write, quote, "For hate crimes, Bill C-16 adds gender identity or expression to the identifiable groups protected from those who advocate genocide, publicly incite hatred likely to lead to a breach of the peace, or willfully promote hatred against them." Unquote. So the bill merely adds gender identity and expression to the list of groups you can't advocate genocide or incite hatred against. This seems reasonable. And if you object to hate crime laws for whatever reason, Bill C-16 does not compel or prohibit language as Peterson claims, unless, of course, you plan to start advocating genocide. As we continue to read the letter, we see the Canadian law also protects the kind of expression and speaking of truths Peterson worries might become illegal. He has a concern that the law will make it illegal to discuss current research into things like sex differences. But again, we see that according to the Canadian Bar Association, quote, "The amendment of the Canadian Human Rights Act will not compel the speech of private citizens, nor will it hamper the evolution of academic debates about sex and gender, race and ethnicity, nature and culture, and other genuine and continuing inquiries that mark our common quest for understanding of the human condition. The amendment will, however, make explicit the existing requirement for the federal government and federally regulated providers of goods and services to ensure that personal information like sex or gender is collected only for legitimate purposes and not used to perpetuate discrimination or undermine privacy rights." So the Canadian Bar Association clearly states that Canadian law protects exactly the kind of speech Peterson worries will become illegal. It also points out that Bill C-16 will extend legal protections against employment discrimination to a group that previously did not have them explicitly under law, which again seems reasonable and unobjectionable. According to the text of the bill and lawyers with relevant understanding, unless you advocate for genocide against trans people, you should not find yourself in any legal trouble. Now, Jordan Peterson has made a big show of his willingness to stand up for his principles and subject himself to legal consequences in protest if necessary.
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues.
But can the law do this? According to Brenda Cossman, a law professor at the University of Toronto, no. She points out that even if the law made pronoun usage compulsory in the future, it would not punish people by sending them to jail. She writes, quote, "Non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression may very well be interpreted by the courts in the future to include the right to be identified by a person's self-identified pronoun." The Ontario Human Rights Commission, for example, in their Policy on Preventing Discrimination because of Gender Identity and Expression, states that gender harassment should include refusing to refer to a person by their self-identified name and proper personal pronoun. In other words, pronoun use may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and courts. And the remedies? Monetary damages, non-financial remedies. For example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to job, and public interest remedies. For example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. So jail time is not one of the possible punishments for violating this law. Many Peterson followers will note that this passage includes reference to the Ontario Human Rights Council document, Policy on Preventing Discrimination because of Gender Identity and Expression, a document that Peterson uses to claim Bill C-16 will compel people to use preferred pronouns. But according to Cossman and the Canadian Bar Association, even if the law gets interpreted that way, you would still need to advocate genocide on top of misusing pronouns in order to get charged with a hate crime. We can see this here when Cossman writes, quote, "Refusing to use a person's self-identified pronoun is not going to be considered advocating genocide, unless the refusal to use the pronouns was accompanied by actually advocating genocide against trans and gender non-binary folk. Similarly, it's hard to see the refusal to use the appropriate pronoun without something else rising to the threshold of hate speech. Hate speech laws in Canada have only been used and only can be used against extreme forms of speech, explicitly and extreme forms of homophobic, anti-Semitic, or racist speech. Moreover, prosecution needs the approval of the Attorney General. Again, the law legislates against advocating genocide against trans people. That's it. Hate speech laws in Canada only apply to the most extreme forms of speech, and prosecution even requires the approval of the Attorney General. For what it is worth, Cossman states that she is not a big fan of hate speech laws, but as long as other groups get protection, trans people should too, and I tend to agree. At best, Peterson pointed out a lack of clarity in the interpretation of the law, and for that he deserves some credit. But according to the documents in question and every credible source, it does not do what he warned it would do. Now I realize this might not convince some Peterson fans. I have just cited people from the Canadian legal establishment, and according to Peterson, these people might be compromised in some way, might have an interest in seeing this law go forward, or not understand the dangers of this law. For Peterson fans who doubt this, I will ask you a question. If Peterson was right about the law, why has he not found himself in legal trouble? He claimed merely speaking out against it could put him in violation of it, yet nobody has charged him with the crime, despite the fact that he has continued to do so. Nor has anyone else been charged. What's more, similar laws have been on the books in other Canadian provinces for years without incident. Perhaps a case involving this law and pronoun usage will come about, but given the small number of trans people and the nature of how we use pronouns, I will get to that in a minute. That could take years, which hardly seems like the urgent and widespread threat to freedom Peterson warns about. At this point, some Peterson fans might say, wait, don't you know what happened to Lindsay Shepard at Laurier University? Well, obviously, since I just mentioned it, but it seems her problem had more to do with overzealous administrators than it did with Bill C-16. I have dealt with these kind of people in an overly bureaucratic institution, and I sympathize with her because it sucks when this happens. But it happens with or without laws like this, and it never caused her any legal trouble. I will admit that Peterson has a point when he criticizes the way HR departments operate, but that seems like a separate issue from this law. Peterson has repeatedly warned that this law represents the beginning of a neo-Marxist, postmodernist plot that will erode the foundations of Western civilization. He invokes parallels between this law and Stalinist Russia. Despite what Peterson claims, I don't see a path down the slippery slope from this law to the Gulag, and even Joe Rogan questioned it during Peterson's last appearance on his podcast. Peterson has used this kind of hyperbole to draw attention to himself and sell his products, his self-authoring program, his books. Before he made his earnings through the site private, he pulled in over $50,000 a month from his Patreon alone. Much of this attention came because he fed people's fears of trans people by implicating them in an imagined postmodernist plot that came from his misreading of Bill C-16. I find this a very sleazy way to promote yourself. But then again, this comes from a guy who feels guilty that he uses Reddit solely to promote his YouTube channel. Peterson's fear-mongering about neo-Marxist plots also reminds me of the kind of nonsense we left back in the Cold War. In a previous video, I pointed out how his paranoia about pronoun laws reminded me of John Birch's Society conspiracy theories about communists fluoridating the water supply. And I'm going to quickly revisit that because it amuses me so much, and I think it probably amuses a lot of people quite a bit. Here's a good mashup of Jordan Peterson and Jack D. Ripper from Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove.
Rises these bloody neo-Marxists that have invaded the campuses and that are in the process of invading the rest of the culture as fast as they can possibly manage it. I'm not their friends, not in the least.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest.
Have you ever heard of a thing called fluoridation? Fluoridation of water? Do you realize that fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face?
And OISI, for example, in Ontario, is perhaps, apart from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the most dangerous institution in Canada.
You realize that in addition to fluoridating water, where there are studies underway to fluoridate salt, flour, fruit juices, soup, sugar, milk, ice cream, Mandrake, children's ice cream. Good.
They're interested in the indoctrination of people as young as they can get their hands on.
That's the way a hardcore commie works.
They don't believe that there's any such thing as competence. They don't believe that there's any such thing as up.
On no account will a commie ever drink water, and not without good reason.
Communist infiltration, communist indoctrination.
Now, some Peterson fans might find this comparison unfair. Worrying about fluoride in the water is ludicrous. This is a real law that could infringe on freedoms. But I have to disagree. The idea that trans people, a group of people who make up 0.3% of the population, could pose any real threat to society should appear absurd on the face of it. It looks even more absurd when you consider that only a subset of this already small group advocates for the non-binary pronouns Peterson objects to, and a yet even smaller subset of that group wants to make laws requiring them. If those people even exist and they're not a figment of Peterson's imagination. Even if the number of transgender people multiplied by 10, we would still only be talking about 3% of the population. Even if Peterson got everything right, which he clearly did not, What would be the worst case scenario? You need to use someone's pronouns? I agree with Peterson that the law should not compel you to do so. But is that really the totalitarian scenario Peterson paints? That really should not present a problem for a reasonable person, and given that trans people make up such a small percent of the population, it seems unlikely that anyone who objects will ever have to deal with this problem. What's more, given the nature of the English language, we tend to use the pronouns in question mostly when someone is not present. Most of the time when I speak to someone in person, I call them by their name or by the pronoun you. So even if you did misgender somebody, nobody would probably ever find out. If they did, they probably would not want to go through the process of pressing charges against you for it, if they could even afford it. So given all this, even if Peterson had gotten this law right, I think all these factors bring the likelihood of someone getting charged with not using pronouns to a number incredibly close to zero. Therefore, I find Peterson's response to this law as paranoid, delusional, and ridiculous as concerns about communist plots to fluoridate the water supply. I have not even talked about his use of the term cultural Marxism, a term that the alt-right uses that comes from the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of cultural Bolshevism that the Nazis used. Peterson probably realized this because he no longer uses this term. He now says neo-Marxist or postmodernism, but it's the same conspiracy theory. I will link to a video by 3 Arrows that goes into this because this video is already long enough, and he's done a good job outlining this. Now, I realize a lot of his fans have a hard time hearing this kind of criticism, but just because he gets things wrong or has some very questionable politics does not mean he has nothing to say. I actually enjoyed listening to his lectures on psychology as it is his area of expertise. I just don't agree with his politics at all. When I first saw him come on the scene, I thought to myself, wow, this Jungian clinical psychologist makes tons of his lectures available online for free. That's so great. But boy, does he have some reactionary red-baiting politics. You can like some things about someone and dislike other things. We need not see the world in terms of black and white. I think too often we feel we must either love or condemn someone, and I don't find that useful. I also think that Peterson gets some things right about political correctness and gender issues that we on the left need to take seriously. His criticisms have some truth to them, and rather than turn away from this, we should parse out what he gets wrong and right. I plan to do this in regards to his statements about gender in a future video. He has made some outrageous statements on the subject recently, and I think he has frankly gotten carried away with his moment in the spotlight. But I also think he gained his popularity because in the past, he made valid statements about gender issues from his field of expertise. I think rather than go with the knee-jerk reaction he wants us to have when he brings up sex differences, which just feeds his narrative of the triggered leftist, we need to try and criticize some of his more valid statements honestly. His observations about gender need not support right-wing political and cultural norms. Some of them could just as easily work to promote more progressive values. Thanks for watching, folks. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you really like what I do, please contribute to my Patreon or make a PayPal donation. I also have some t-shirts for sale. They feature the major arcana of the tarot deck that you find decorating my channel and I'm using as an avatar at this moment. Throughout this video, I have used the Hermit as my avatar, but I have almost all 22 major arcana of the tarot available. You can check out a bunch of different ones. Here are some of them. They're available in different colors and in different styles. I have women's tees and long sleeve and unisex. I have links to all this in the description. Please check it out. I'm Greg Belvedere. Remember, all generalizations are stupid, so never speak in absolutes. Thanks for watching. See you next time.